I had to ship a device that had radioactive material inside it. You have to have chain of custody that's very specific. You have to always know where they're at all times.
He's a very seasoned logistics and supply chain leader, more than 20 years of experience across a lot of things that we normally don't really think about: pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, global logistics, hazardous materials.
Safety is primary in the military because you're moving equipment, you're moving personnel. Sometimes you're moving explosives and it's on the same aircraft.
Welcome to Supply Chain Optimizers, the show that uncovers the controversial strategies and candid stories of innovators and disruptors from some of the world's largest supply chain operations. Let's cut through the noise and optimize your logistics and supply chain, one bold idea at a time.
Welcome to Supply Chain Optimizers. I'm Diego Solorzano, and today it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ben Taylor. He's a very seasoned logistics and supply chain leader, more than 20 years of experience across a lot of things that we normally don't really think about, right? Pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, global logistics, hazardous materials. He has built and scaled international supply chains supporting clinical trials across, for instance, 90 countries. He implemented Lean Six Sigma practices for operational efficiency, managed a bunch of hazardous materials with rigorous compliance standards. Beyond his corporate work, Ben also serves in the Air National Guard, bringing a military precision and discipline to logistics. His career uniquely bridges highly regulated medical supply chains, dangerous goods handling, real-world military logistics, and that gives him a very rare perspective on challenges and patience in global operations. Ben, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it, and I'm excited to have a conversation.
Ben, what initially drew you to this intersection of logistics, healthcare, military operations, everything that I just quoted? How did your career evolve from your earlier roles to global leadership?
Well, I think like most people in logistics, I kind of just fell into the position. It's not something that even when people go to school for logistics, it tends to be business management, and there's a hole that needs to be filled. And so somebody jumps into it. Usually they're thrown into it. And that's similar to what happened to me. I didn't ever anticipate being this. My degree is in international economics, and I love geography. I love international business. This is kind of a very normal fit. You know, when you talk to people and they're talking about, well, we need to ship something from Moldova. If you were asked them to point on a map where Moldova is, they probably couldn't do it. And so that's where I kind of come in and started business with my dad. And then he got sick, so we ended up having to sell that. I got into management and manufacturing. Then with the military, that gave me a lot of other international, different sorts of cargo and shipping experience. And then I fell into clinical trials, and I've been doing that for a while now. And now with Precision Medicine Group, it's just kind of one of those things that a lot of people I've spoken to just kind of fell into it to fill a need, and then fix a department, and then you gain more experience, kind of move up that scale. And that's kind of where I came into it. And then with the military, the same thing. I switched fields from doing electronics and communications navigation work into logistics and cargo. And then it really behooved and helped my career because we had to deal with really different types of shipping, different shipping lanes, dangerous goods, hazardous materials, and working with IATA and CFR 49, those sorts of things. So that's going to help me in this field. And again, that was not what I originally planned. I went in the infantry before I went into college. And then all of it just kind of brought me into the position I'm in now with international shipping and logistics.
It's interesting. Yeah, a true geography nerd. I also adore geography, maps, etc. As soon as you mentioned Moldova, I immediately thought of the capital city, Kishinev, right? Yeah. I can go all day talking about, weird geography, fun facts and stuff.
Yeah, globes. I grew up looking at globes, and it's a shame that people don't have globes much anymore. They just hop
not much anymore
because there's so much to be said about flipping through a book that has maps. You see the terrain, especially the topographical globes. So you're rubbing your hands on it. You're seeing the map, the mountains here, the mountains there. They get bigger in the Andes or they get bigger in the Alps. And just imagining what people had to go through to do that, and then traveling with the military, and you see some of these areas, and it's amazing to think what humanity has had to go through just to go 35 miles across certain areas. And it's no wonder they didn't communicate with each other. And then nowadays you just take it all for granted. So it's, I think geography, you have to really like geography to enjoy global logistics.
Man, I absolutely agree. We're deviating off topic a little bit, but during my days at Stanford, my favorite piece of Stanford was their map room. You have fantastic
Yeah.
map room. It's just full of maps, right? And a very, very large collection of maps. And I
Yeah.
could just be there for hours. So I agree. There's
Yeah.
some component of loving geography to loving global logistics, right?
There is, and I think there's still some, like, if you think about even going through when Europeans were moving through Africa in the 1800s, 1700s, or even when the Europeans or anyone were moving through Central America or South America, we take for granted today that a plane can fly over it. But to think any stories that went on there, having to move from one place to another, supplies, or even if you think about Easter Island, where they said they were moving, I don't know how true it is, they were moving the trees in certain areas, moving stones when they built the pyramids in Central America or anywhere else, the complication of that. And today we just take it for granted that you're going to move through a jungle or move over mountains. And so it's amazing to think what humanity had to go through to deal with supplies and logistics 400 years ago, for, 250 years ago, forget about even in the last 50 years or even now. And I think talking to project managers, talking to people, they don't realize that, all right, you have a bumpy dirt road. Can't you just get it there in an 18-wheeler? And that's not how it was. That's not at all how. Sometimes mopeds are, in dealing in certain areas, we've had to deal with logistics companies using local service providers, and they were mopeds because that was the way they got around, and it was faster. They could weave in and out of traffic. So they still adhere to, SOPs and adhere to what you had to do for safety. But sometimes that's a faster route than you would think. Throw in the back of an Amazon truck and take it where it's going. So
fascinating. And I have absolutely agree. We just take it for granted, similar to global logistics. And speaking of that, right? You've worked extensively, very extensively in global medical logistics. But there's a distinction here, right? Like managing clinical trial supply chains and some more traditional pharmaceutical logistics, right? Can you just give us the 101 on how these are different or similar?
Yeah, so they're not. Pharmaceuticals is very complicated. There's a lot of regulatory items that go with that. There's a lot of different temperature controls. They tend to move through much larger chains because you're talking about drugs versus a clinical trial. There's different phases of that, right? So when you're moving the drugs in particularly, you have to have the very specific regulations that are moving those. You have to have chain of custody that's very specific. You have to always know where they're at all times. And then when they arrive where they're going, they have to be under basically a quarantine. They're not, but they have to be highly regulated where they go. When you look at supply chains and clinical trials, we may be moving specifics of a lab kit or a blood draw kit, but that's still different than the drugs themselves. So within the industry, there's also different regulatory commitments that you have to adhere to. And a lot of the couriers will work with that. You have to deal with a lot of importer and exporter issues with that. So when you're looking at supply chain, you're saying, all right, we need to move a computer, or we have to move a desk. We have to move these specific goods and materials. That becomes very different when all of a sudden you're saying we have to move 25,000 drug samples somewhere. Okay. Or even when you're looking at certain biospecimens and blood samples, there are some countries that are very particular about how they move those, or if they even want them leaving the country. And China is a good example. There are certain countries that are difficult to move samples out of. So a lot of medical trials companies, they will just open a lab in that country because it makes it much easier. And then you get into, most people today don't think about AIDS and HIV. 30 years ago, that was a big deal, and it was very dangerous, I guess, to move those. Today, though, while it's still a horrible disease and it's dangerous, it's handled much more lightly, saying, oh, you know what, there's a possibility this may have HIV, this sample. It's not a big deal. It still ships the same way something with the flu, somebody who has, any of these other diseases or sicknesses that we may not think a big deal of. But then when you get into tuberculosis or you get into the bubonic plague, those now ship as a category A versus a category B. And now you change your licensing because you're not allowed to ship those. So there's a lot of different regulations that go into shipping the drug part versus the supply chain. And supply chain is so vast that shipping pens might just be supply chain, but that's not necessarily going to be under clinical trial. And we think, we may ship a laptop or a tablet because it assists with scanning in barcodes or other things we use. But some countries are very regulated in the batteries that you're shipping. So now that does affect the pharmaceutical or the clinical trial side more so than the pharmaceutical. But that also is, now we have to figure out how do we source it internally inside the country versus shipping externally. So there's a lot of those items that go into it, and that we have to look at. Some things that you never think of. The way the codes go into the items, you can have one item that ships a certain way, exact same item, different gauge, and all of a sudden it ships under a different HTS code, and now it becomes regulated. Band-Aids are a good example. If you have antibiotics on it, the antibiotic can now make it ship as a dangerous good, and countries don't want to take it in, but you're like, it's just a Band-Aid with Neosporin. Well, it's, regulatory across the board how those things are handled. And so the supply chain of pharmaceuticals, kind of two different parts, but they do melt over into one another, and they do cause a lot of difficulties because most people don't think of those terms. So we're just thinking it's just a Band-Aid with antibiotics. It might be, but some countries don't view it that way.
That's a very interesting answer. I have so much to unpack here as I was taking some of the notes of going deeper, right? Let's maybe, keep it, our audience really loves examples, right? You did mention some countries are way harder to deal with, so that you end up actually opening up a facility there just so that you don't have to ship anything. Can you give us an example and maybe, double click on what are, biggest challenges, right, in maintaining these supply chains running?
Well, even just between the EU and the UK now, there's issues sometimes moving things back and forth. 15 years ago, that was easy. If you had it in Europe, you could go to the UK. Wasn't a big deal with Norway. It wasn't a big deal with any of these countries. Now, though, with the UK going through Brexit, they're creating their own supplies. So what used to be just a CE standard item for anything I was going to touch subject, now the UK still adheres to that, but they're going to go to the UK CE. So there's a lot of adjustments that have to be made just within that area. And then even within certain countries, you can export out of Netherlands or France and not have a problem. But if you're going to export something out of Spain, now, even though it's the same economic union, you have to fill out certain paperwork. So it's easier to open a location in the EU because Spain can ship to Germany or to Netherlands, not a problem. Italy goes there, not a problem. But if you want to ship from Italy or Spain to the US, now you have to go through certain regulatory standards. And it's the same with Australia. Australia has specific standards. So having a lab there, because it's so far away from Europe and America, makes it much easier. And you also don't have to worry about some of the having an importer of record available, exporter of record. And a lot of people look at New Zealand and say, oh, well, New Zealand and Australia. It's like saying US and Canada, until, 2017, 2018, things were a little easier.
Really?
Now things are a little more difficult to ship between there. And we're basically, sibling nations. And what used to be a 16 to 20 hour lane is now a 48-hour lane. And that's difficult for a lot of people to understand because in our heads, we still think it's just Canada. And I'm sure Canadians think it's just the US, but it's not that simple anymore due to whatever is going on governmentally. So now we have the issues with moving things back and forth. And it's not even as easy as, well, if you're in Montreal, I'm going to drive it over the border to Vermont because they still have to clear customs and then you still have to fly it. So you have to get a flight out. And China is a good example because they're very protective of anything that's genetic or DNA. So it behooves a company to try and open a lab there and do all of their information, pass the regulatory bodies that have to handle any of that information in the labs. You sanitize the information, and then you can share it with the sponsor or the client who's working that study. South Africa is another one. They don't like shipping. Nobody likes shipping infectious goods, but South Africa is very particular to highly infectious. They don't want it moving around. They're going to keep it specifically in there. So going through all these regulations, we think today we just look at, the internet gets everything around. You can look up whatever you want. Your doctor, you can basically use, an AI system to be your medical practitioner almost, but you still have to move the goods around. And there's still a lot of, I don't want to say biases, but there's still a lot of regulatory standards that you have to pass. And the FDA is a good example. They have a lot of things that are older as regulations still in place that to us may not make sense, but there's a reason why it takes 10 years for clinical trials to make their money back. They want to get these things in place. And that's how it goes with opening locations and trying to move things around different countries. So something as simple as, Indonesia and Philippines, they're two very different countries with very different regulations. So we have to, really watch how we're moving things around that area. And even at that point, when you look at the islands in the Philippines, there are so many islands there that part of what we do is try and advise our clients on how to do things logistically. But if you're looking at a very small sampling of subjects, trying to get things in and out of a country, just within a country, from one island to the next, where you can process it and then move it out of that country, it's very difficult. And then you also have some, religious regulations with who wants to handle whatever. And so that also starts to have a lot of issues. We used to be able to move things between Middle Eastern countries and Israel. Obviously, 2 years ago, that ceased. But when you're in the middle of a clinical trial, that causes a big hiccup and a big issue. And so those regulations and those governmental bodies having issues, it ends up being tit for tat and a lot of stuff, and causes a lot of issues shipping internationally.
Yeah, fascinating problem to think about, right? And so specific. And I guess, if we step back a little bit, this is obviously a very highly regulated, right? How do you approach building this culture of safety, compliance, and at the same time being efficient, right? Because there's got to be some trade-offs there on, I can just do whatever, it takes nothing to just ship it, versus, I have to be very compliant and have this culture of compliance and safety. How do you think about this balance?
Well, I think a lot of it starts at the very beginning. If we know we have to ship somewhere, or we have clients asking us a question, we need to review that. We need to work with the trade and compliance team, talk about the different regulatory items that are important there. And then once you get that standard, you keep that, and you advise clients on it as much as possible. And when we're talking about dealing with dangerous goods, a lot of times we're dealing with a reagent, or we're dealing with something that's a very small amount of dangerous good. But we do have to ship sometimes radioactive material. So that has its own standards as a class 7 material that you have to ship. So when we're looking at that, normally I find you work from the very beginning, and it's a partnership between us and our sponsors and our clients. And anyone we work with dealing with this, we kind of have to look at it as a partnership. So, maybe if you're shipping clothes, or whether it's, Temu or it's Amazon, the partnership, they want to keep their client. But to be honest with you, they're shipping whatever they're shipping, and it's getting there. They have these large bodies that work with that. For us, and when you look at that, they're not advising the people they're shipping their computer or their jeans or their books to. They're not saying, listen, we need you to be here at this point, and do you have any issues on your street you have to worry about? They just ship it. For us, when we look at the beginning of a study and a client comes to us, we start saying, what countries you're looking at? All right, these are the issues you may have here. Oh, do you want to go to Georgia? All right, that's fine. But anything outside Tbilisi, we're going to have to look at an extended shipping time. You want to go to Turkey? That's fine. Ankara, Istanbul, no problem. So these are issues. For example, I had to work with shipping to Pakistan once, and we needed dry ice, but the sites didn't have their own dry ice. So we had to work closely with a specialty courier to ship there, bring dry ice in. But of course, temperature-wise, you have a variation of temperatures from really hot to cold in Pakistan. So they had, within 5 days, basically, they had to bring the dry ice in, clear customs, have the sites pack out their samples, put it in dry ice. The courier had to have extra dry ice to supply the dry ice, then pack it back out. And then it was a 5 to 7 day route back to the laboratory. So we don't think about these. We just say it's dry ice coming in, dry ice going out. But from a regulatory standpoint, we have to look at that and say, how do we get dry ice even to Greece? If you're going to northern Greece and you're outside of Athens, how do you say, how can we get dry ice to those sites? And how can we manage that? Because they also have to be trained in handling dry ice. So anyone who touches dry ice has to also have some sort of dangerous goods training on it. And that's where we talk to the client at the very beginning. That's how we try and adhere to SOPs. We work through lab manuals. We work through training for the sites. Sometimes we do videos to show them how they have to handle this. And we're talking about from a supply chain side or our kit packing. We're working with them too to say, hey, do you have a hazardous material cabinet you can store this in? Now we have to have somebody who can manage the distance. Do you have to have it segregated in a certain area? Does it have to be quarantined? Can you put this hazardous material in the cabinet with that hazardous material? So that comes down at that point to having a safety person on site that can train the people touching it. You limit the amount of people who are going to handle the hazardous materials. And then the big thing is shipping internationally. You have to make sure that you have the correct permits in place, that you're licensed, that the couriers you're going to work with are licensed certain ways. And there's a lot of those different regulatory items that go into that, and whether it's free trade zones. So there's all these crazy things that go into that. And a lot of times we lean on the couriers and the logistics companies we're working with to get that information. And then we log it. And then for future reference, say, all right, I hate to say there's a lot of trial and error, unfortunately, but when an error occurs, you're like, take note of that. We're not going to be able to do that again. So in this country, but then you also have issues where, I hate to say it, sometimes the customs agent may just not be in a great mood that day. And we had this recently. 5 packages went through, 1 didn't, and they all shipped together, all in the same
Wow.
pallet, everything they moved together. Some went through, they have to pull a certain percentage. And we're still working on trying to get that cleared many weeks later when our client's like, yeah, but the other ones were no problem. That's true. And it is what it is, unfortunately, with customs. So we try and train and we try and prevent it by preparing for the issue ahead of time. And that's really the biggest thing. And when you talk about lean, the least amount of touches you have on the item, the more likely it is to be safe, the more likely you'll be able to train somebody properly. So I think a lot of that goes into working with compliance teams, making sure we know ahead of time that it is a dangerous good, making sure that we set everything up properly on the front end. Once we find out we might need a different chemical, we have to make sure we have the proper location for it and we can ship it properly. And then letting the couriers know, especially if we have a relationship with them, we're going to have to ship this. What do we need? So that they know chain of custody and their drivers can handle it. Because some places drivers can't handle a dangerous good or they can't handle dry ice. What do we have to do at that point? So I think it's the preparation, the knowledge of knowing we're shipping and working before we even ship something or a study kicks off on how to properly handle it.
Have there been any innovations or technologies that significantly reduce this risk or basically improve this process or improve handling efficiency? What are you looking at from terms of innovations and technologies helping you do this more effectively?
Well, for one thing, I will say AI in general has helped us with trying to research different correlations, especially with lanes, right? When you only have 24 to 48 hours to ship something, the couriers have a very good idea of how they could do this. But sometimes we do have to go back and say, hey, can we ship it this way instead? We know it seems like a longer route. And they're always open to that, right? Because they're looking at the most efficient way, it might add cost, but we can use AI to find a correlation between errors or find an issue. And sometimes it seems like it's a search engine, but there's a lot deeper review on an AI, especially as it holds information and say, hey, we're looking at this item. There's a problem here. Is there anything we have to look at within the next 3 months that could cause an issue to our clients in this region? Are there political or economic issues? Is there an election that's coming up? So those are things that we can utilize AI for, which seems very high level. It's not really digging in, but over time, it will maintain that information. It says, just like you did this time, and it holds on to that, which a regular search engine doesn't do. But also the packaging materials are getting much better. As we look at environmentally friendly, as we look at recyclable packaging or reusable packaging, that's also helping with keeping costs down, because there are some packaging companies that have you can plug the item in and you can charge it so you can reuse it later on, but it costs a more upfront, but over time, as you space that over all the months, it actually decreases your cost. It helps in environmental items because you're not throwing styrofoam or boxes away. So we look at that also for materials, because obviously we want to keep plastics out of the environment. We want to try and do what we can on that issue and use recyclables. So in that way, technology is also helping. How can we use oil less? How can we use more cardboard? How can we use a reusable package? And then we run into situations where, Russia, you can't use a reusable package. You have to use a one-time use package. Well, if we're trying to stay environmentally friendly, that's not always the best way to do that. And you look at other countries that have packaging materials they have to use specific to that country. And then we also come into, how do we keep our carbon footprint down? How do we take this one pound package and try and keep our environment, our carbon footprint down as much as possible, because it's going on a vehicle that is utilizing diesel gasoline. It's probably not electric. And then it's going to go on a plane that's using jet fuel, and it's going to fly through the air, in which this one pound package is going through all this.
Right.
It's going to touch down, go on another diesel truck. So do our couriers use electric vehicles? Do they find a way, like, UPS said, they always turn right, so they cut down on time. Right. So it seems really silly in that aspect, but in that way, technology has helped us. For logistics itself, from a clinical trial standpoint, we are shipping a 1 and 2 pound package all over the world to try and get to a lab as quickly as possible. So the way we really assist with technology is, how do we use technology to find the best route? How do we talk to our couriers that we can do things electronically versus via paper? how do we look at our carbon footprint and try and utilize electric vehicles as much as possible, or that we can group shipments together so that we're using a lot less. And I think that's where we're going to find a lot of those savings in technology and environmentally. So and like I said, I think your background is AI, so you may look at what I'm saying with AI and be like, that's not really what we can do with AI, but it is how we utilize it a lot to try and gather as much information as possible, give it the correct variables, and then it will feed us what we want. And we can, and the nice thing is what you can't do with a search engine or something else is ask it questions and say, well, reanalyze this or look at this. What if, is there another route you can use while it might be longer kilometer wise, but it'll actually be shorter time wise. So those are things that a search engine isn't going to do. And then that gives us information to have this relationship with our couriers and go back to them and say, hey, can you look at here? What about this? And those are items that technology, AI, you couldn't do that 5 years ago. You couldn't do it 7 years ago. But now there's enough in there that it'll find correlations between different shipments. We can ask it different problems. Is there a problem here with dry ice? We're finding this issue, and we've done this before. We're having this issue, but we only have it from one location. Did you try looking at this? And it'll give us feedback on what we may have missed. So while that is not an in-depth coding AI situation, it does help us technologically, which 7-8 years ago, we wouldn't be able to do. And so technology-wise, there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but a lot of it is materials, figuring out the best routes, saving with electricity versus carbon footprint, and then using AI to try and find correlations or different routes that we may not have known otherwise.
Very, very interesting. I appreciate the thoughtful answer. Before we switch gears to some more operational questions, just an anecdote, right? To the extent that you can talk about it. What's the coolest or strangest material that you've ever moved?
The coolest or strangest material.
Maybe it's coolest and strangest. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in military wise, there's been some pretty cool stuff. Clinical trials wise, I had to ship a device that had radioactive material inside it. And so I guess it doesn't sound that like cool per se, but there's a lot that goes into that because there's so much communication that has to go around it. And then you have to say, well, can we measure the radioactivity? Well, what is the radioactivity of this? How far does that radiation move out so that you can actually ship it? Because you have to segregate it. You have to have packaging. Does it have to be in lead? There's a lot of those things. And I think from my standpoint, that is a bothersome material to ship, but it's also the most interesting with the most conversations.
For sure.
And I will say a lot of the studies we deal with, there are a lot of different viruses and things that we ship. And there are questions sometimes when you're looking at TB. I had to deal with the bubonic plague once. It was coming out of an area, dealing with Ebola. So those, depending on where you're at, there's a lot of those questions that come up. And I mean, anyone in their normal day life would never have to think, do we have to worry about Ebola and HIV in something that's shipping? And to think that, well, HIV is the least important of everything because growing up as a kid, everyone was all about it, like, oh, HIV. And now it's like, it's like the flu. You're okay. Don't worry about it. You'll get over it in a little while.
Oh my
God. Whoa, but Ebola or TB, those things now. So dealing with that and the packaging, that's been interesting. But I do really like dealing with these into different areas, like I said about Pakistan, dry ice. How do you get dry ice to Pakistan? How do you figure out how to get a material, no matter what it is, from some outlying city in Indonesia or Philippines to their capital city where you can export it? And that seems to be the most interesting conversations more than materials. But I think the most interesting material has been shipping a device that used radioactive material. And then, you get that question once every 10 years. And your project manager is like, I've never gotten this question. I don't even know what this is. But they said it's a problem. And then we have to look at it and I have to say, I don't know why it's a problem. So I reach out to a trade compliance team of the courier and say, why is this the problem? We're looking at this. And they come back and like, well, where's it coming from? What's the radiation? It has radiation. All right, let's go back here. A lot of going back and forth in those things. So that's probably in clinical trial side, the most interesting thing that I've shipped.
Pretty cool. Let's switch gears a little bit. You have both civilian, let's say, right, military logistics experience. How do you compare the operational mindsets of and the approaches between these two? Are there any differences, any similarities? How do you?
Yeah, very big differences. I think the biggest thing is in the military, it's horrible to say, we're there to spend money. We don't care about a budget. If we have to go somewhere and do something, We
Wow.
do it the way we have to do it. When we deploy, we're given a certain budget to a certain point. But as soon as we say, listen, we have to do it this way, this is how it has to go. Safety is primary in the military because you're moving equipment, you're moving personnel.
Right.
Sometimes you're moving explosives and it's on the same aircraft. And then you have to say, all right, according to IATA, because we still have to adhere, even under certain conditions, we still have to adhere to international safety standards, especially when we're flying into different countries. So if we're touching down in Germany and then we're going somewhere else, we have to adhere to EU standards because we're passing through there. So in the military, you do what you can, you put it together, you figure out how to fly there, and then what's the cost? Who cares? This is the mission that has to get there. On civilian side, no client wants to hear, I don't care what the cost is. I'm going to get your stuff here, even if it's $47,000 per shipment, which you've had to do. You get a charter flight and $37,000 later, the client's like, well, we had to get the sample there, right? So that mindset is very different because in the military, you just throw people at it and you say, let's figure this out. I don't care if you're not getting sleep for 24 hours. We have to get people here. We have to move this. We have to mitigate this issue. Doesn't matter if you're walking on the tarmac and your boots are melting, stand in the shade. Like that's just how it goes. On the civilian side, though, we're saying, no, we can't throw these people at it. This is what our budget is. This is how we have to handle this. We can't skirt regulations because it's depending on how it's shipping, right? In the military, you can say, this is a mission essential item. You have to get it here. This is how we're going to manage it. Maybe you never take it off the plane and you can get around certain regulations. On civilian side, though, it's never like that. It's either passengers also or cargo only. And that's about that restriction with the planes. Then you get in some other items such as, can they even ship it into this country? Can we not ship it in this country? How do we get it there? The military, to be honest with you, we don't think about that. We say, just don't take it off the plane and somebody pull guard on it. And that's what you're doing. But on the civilian side, we have to look at those budgets. We have to say, this isn't cost effective. Is there somebody else who can do it more cost effective? If we can't get it here, if we can't get it to the location this way, we have to find a different way. Even if we have to circumnavigate the globe. How do we get it from, an outer lying island to the capital city where the lab is? In the military, they're just like, we're going to put it on a helicopter, we're taking it. Right. Civilian side, they don't have a helicopter to throw it on. So they're like, all right, let's think about different ways to do this. How do we cross the border? In the military, again, if you have to go from, let's say, Kenya to South Africa, all you're doing is your people are taking care of it ahead of time. And they're saying, all right, you've been cleared to land, but you can't get off the plane. They're going to have their people come and grab it. On the civilian side, it doesn't work like that. There's customs, there's different regulatory bodies you have to deal with. There's a lot of those different, and again, if we were to fly even now, if we were to say, I'm going to fly from Turkey to Israel with the military, so be it. They have to deal with it. Civilian side, you're not flying right now from Turkey to Israel. So there's a lot of those issues that we have to look at on the civilian side, which in the military side, you kind of just put your head down and you go through. Yeah. And you may have a time limit on the military side, but really it's just the time limit of how long does it take to get where you're going. Civilian side, sometimes we have stability that's 24 hours. Sometimes you have to get it from point A to point B in 16 hours because these samples have a viability that they don't go beyond that. So we rarely deal with that on the military side, but the civilian side, you also have to take that into account. Like we tend to look at, in general, what is the stability of the material? Then what is the turnaround time is the second option. And then what is the cost? Because if you have a stability of 2 weeks, if it's on dry ice, and then your turnaround time you can find in 96 hours, now you can start to use a different courier because you have all this time. In the military, they're just like, we're going to get it here. This is how long it's going to take. If you're on the ground there, you're just going to have to deal with it. And that's what it is.
Now, something that I like a lot. Oh, sorry. Please.
No, go ahead.
No, something that I really enjoyed about your answers is how much you touch on other countries' cultures, right? You've been doing like quite literally global logistics for a number of years now. The question here is, okay, how like countries' cultures, right? A lot of them and a lot of countries and a lot of cultures. How do you cultivate these alignment, trust, accountability, right? Especially it's very regulated environments, right? How do you build teams and account for, let's keep it high performing and let's acknowledge the cultures? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to every culture appreciates honesty and being candid, but there's different ways to go about it. So if you're dealing with somebody who's in Germany or Netherlands, they tend to be much more blunt than Americans are. And this has happened sometimes where they state something, and I've had American team members who work for me say, but they're so rude. I'm like, but they're not rude. They just don't, Americans are known for saying please and thank you at the beginning and the end of every sentence. We're like hyper polite for what we view as being polite. A lot of people view us as being too verbose. We just talk too much, or we're too friendly, right? So that's part of what we have to work through. And I have had to work with people culturally to say, listen, they're not being rude. They're just asking you a question. And they said hi in the email at the beginning of the chain, but they're not going to say, hey, hi, how are you doing in every instance. At some point, they're just going to start asking questions because you have to get to the point. So I think a lot of it comes down to, from the top to the bottom, you have to understand there's cultural differences. And then you have to have these conversations. Say a lot of Americans don't understand how Europeans go on vacation for 3 weeks at a time. And it just blows our mind that they don't even take a phone with them, right? In America, if you enjoy your job, well, I'm a workaholic. I take my phone with me when I go on vacation. My family's always saying, do you really have to take that call? And I tell them, well, I'm a director. So sometimes I have to take these calls. And if you're European, though, they're VPs. They go away because somebody else will handle a problem. And that's something culturally we have to figure out. But now that comes into a succession plan and how we fix that. And after a while, as we become more global, people start to adhere and understand that a little more. But there's always the conversation. Listen, they're not being rude. They're just not saying hi and please and thank you every time. They're being direct, which is what it is. And I think Americans have really gotten away from that directness, and especially dealing with a lot of Latin countries. I feel that, they love talking about a lot of different things. They're very friendly. Once you hang up, then be like, I don't want to do anything with this guy. He's an idiot. He's fake, whatever it is. So we kind of have to bridge that by showing a certain level of trust and showing that we deal a certain way, being available and open to them when they call. And I think a lot of it comes into just experience of dealing with all these different cultures, because no one can really, it's like dealing with teenagers, right? You can explain to a teenager, don't touch the bottom of the pan because it's hot. And you go to hand them the pan and they go to grab the bottom and you pull it back. You're like, hey, don't touch the bottom. It's hot. So they put gloves on, they go to touch the bottom. You pull the pan back. You're like, listen, I don't know how many times I had to tell you, don't touch the bottom, grab the handles that I'm grabbing right now. And then they finally get it. Until one day they touch the bottom. I'm like, oh, I burned my hand. That's kind of what happens culturally with us. And it goes the other way too, in telling our team members in other countries. And I've had conversations with them separately from Americans saying, listen, Americans talk about a lot of things. We talk about politics. We talk about guns. We talk about families. We talk about a lot of things that other cultures aren't used to. And so it comes down to, if you want me to tell them not to talk about these things, I will do that. But if you don't say anything, I don't know. So if you're uncomfortable with it, address it with me and I'll address it with the team. There's ways to discuss those things without actually insulting anyone and making anyone feel uncomfortable. And around politics, that's a big thing. Around guns, it's another thing. In America, we don't always understand this. We have a lot of people ask us about these. We don't understand the craziness of sports in other countries, right? So we get it sometimes here, but so I think it comes to experience and then working with the teams on each side. But when it comes to dealing with customs and regulatory stuff, when it comes to brokerage houses, dealing with people on the other side, a lot of times we have to leave it up to the couriers and the specialty shippers to deal with that side of it. And when our project managers are like, I don't understand, why is it taking 3 weeks to get something into Brazil? Just like, listen, Brazilians, they're in America and Germany, we want to move things really fast. Brazil, Spain, Italy, Argentina, they kind of want to take their time a little bit, and they're not that worried about it. It's not as important as we view it as. And that's just, siesta in Spain. First time I went to Spain, they said, make sure you get water. When I was in Mallorca, make sure you get water because between 11:30 and 2:30, everything closes.
Yeah, let's get anything.
And not even the hotel staff is working. And you can't drink the water. We couldn't drink the water then. I go there and I'm lying on the tile floor trying to cool off because we were walking around all morning. It was so hot. I'm laying on the floor trying to cool off. And at 2:30, when that hit, we went down there and it still didn't open until 2:35. And the guy's like, oh, you're thirsty. Yeah, I'm thirsty. I'm walking around all morning. I have no water. We drank like 4 bottles of water each. So those are things that culturally, no matter what anyone tells you, you have to just kind of experience. And then you have to kind of apply it to different areas. Not that the Latin and South American countries are all the same. The people are very different. But if you've dealt with certain Spanish or Latin ideas, they tend to resonate throughout most of the countries. Same thing, the Mediterranean countries are very similar. And a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans don't understand, like, we need to get this in here. What is the problem? It's a Mediterranean country. They don't move as quickly or fluidly some of the Northern European countries. So those are items I think and making jokes.
Absolutely.
I think when you're serious all the time about the different cultural divides, people get really serious about it. And I think overall,
Mm.
logistics is serious, but the more flexible and more ready you are to laugh at things, there's some things in logistics that are just laughable. There, it happens one time, and you can't do anything but just find the humor in it. It's maybe dark and sarcastic and cynical humor, but you still have to be somewhat have a sense of humor. And I think that humor goes a long way in building,
Humor goes along.
bonds. Yeah. So I think experience working with individual cultures and letting them know they're not insulting you. They're not just as serious as you, or I know you don't like all the words in the emails, but those are one thing you might have to get used to, so it's, and sometimes English is the business language of the world right now. Right.
Yeah.
So dealing with Asian countries, sometimes they use the wrong word. And I have to, I'll talk to my American, workers and say, have you ever been insulted by them before? No, they're normally very polite. They still are. Just what is the word they use? Now let's work as synonyms because they most likely meant that word, not the one you took it as. Because when you speak the language as a first language, the connotations that come with certain words
Right.
are not seen culturally or across the globe. And so that's another thing, is making sure, like, hey, don't read into the email the way you would speak. Read the email as is, or read the message as is, and don't put any inflections into it. So I think that's a lot of that. Texting is the same way, right? You text somebody, they take the wrong intonation.
Tone is
with it.
lost. Mhm.
And that's how emails work. So we have to just make sure, hey, don't take insult to the email if you've been working with it for 2 years and they've never insulted you before. So there's a lot of that, is trying to teach them about the cultures and language, especially since they're speaking our language. I have to tell my team, how many languages do you speak? Well, I speak English. All right. Well, the person you're dealing with spoke Polish as a first language, learned Czech because her mom was Czech, is speaking Dutch, and English is their fourth language, and they speak all of them fluently. So sometimes they don't always say the right word, and that's it. That's the difficulty. Is English for us is the first word. We deal with the Dutch and the Germans. A lot of people in South America, English is their second language. But you look at somebody from Brazil, they may speak English and Portuguese as their first language, a local dialect of something, and then they're speaking English as their fourth language. And so this is something we have to get used to, and I have to work with the teams. Like, English is probably not even their top 4 languages, and they're still speaking it. Let's give them a little leeway in what they're saying.
Pretty cool, Ben. Ben, a couple of closing questions. One that you started talking to me about before we actually started recording, so I want to leave a record of this. But you did mention around Amazon is not logistics, it's distribution, and you have some discussions with people about this. What did you mean?
So
and how it's changed
Amazon
expectation. Yeah.
It has Amazon, and Amazon does it perfect, right? Gap Warehouse, Amazon, they all do these perfect setups for distribution. When you order something, and most people don't realize there's an Amazon distribution center probably within 1 hour of any major urban area. It may not be as big as in Louisville or LA or somewhere like that, but it's there. Even in Europe, they're building up there. So when you order something from Amazon, the order may go through a central location in another country, but they're delivering it from the building that's 25 miles from your house. That's not logistics, that's distribution. They've perfected buying and getting the materials to that location, and then they contract out, they get somebody to bring it to you. But logistics is moving things globally all around the world. So our expectation with technology, with Amazon, with all of these is that I'm going to get it in 24 to 48 hours. But they're not, it says built, made in Sri Lanka or made in Vietnam on your shirt, but it's sitting in a warehouse 10 miles from where you're at. But we're trying to ship kits and samples through all these regulatory bodies, trying to get them throughout the globe. And so, I tell people all the time that to me, logistics is like spider webs in the forest, right? You're walking through the forest. It's no big deal. You're having a great day. And all of a sudden, a spider web gets on your face and you're flailing. You're pulling it off your face. You're going crazy, right? And everyone's looking at you going, oh, look, somebody just walked in a spider web, right? So my goal in logistics is that we want to keep the spider webs to a minimum. We want to keep them off your face. And when it gets on your face, we want to make sure that we remove it. Amazon has already moved all the spider webs because they're not actually walking through the forest. They're sitting next to a tree, ready to hand you what you want. So that's kind of my goal, is to tell people when I talk to them, logistics and Amazon are two different things. it's one is distribution and one is true logistics. And whether it's moving metal or whether it's moving boxes, whether it's moving goods, our our networks today and our economies are so global and they're so intermixed that it's very difficult to move things from one place to another, especially for what we're doing. We're moving one small item. Amazon has taken thousands of these items, put them on several skids or wherever they're doing, and they've moved it to a location. They've cleared customs as a group. They've done it before you've ever ordered. They're not doing it in real time. And they perfected that. And that's awesome. I love ordering stuff from Amazon. But we are saying we have a subject that's coming in last minute. We didn't know they were coming in. They're going to be here at 7 a.m. in the morning. We have to get to a plane by 12 because it's got to take off. So the courier has to pick up, or the local service provider has to pick up, get it to the airport, make sure the paperwork is good, find a location on the plane, stick it somewhere on that plane, get it into another country, clear customs there, work it through, get it to a lab, and they have to do all this within 24 hours. So we are moving internationally. To me, that is really the difference. Whether logistics is on a boat and they're moving across the oceans, whether it's on a plane, whether it's on a moped going from one location to another, that is really what logistics is, and that's not distribution, because we're bringing it into a final location.
Very interesting.
Amazon is taking it from their final location, which is really a depot, and moving to somebody's house. So we're going from the outside of the spider web in. Amazon is going from the middle of the spider web out. So there's a lot more paths for us to go, but logistics has to manage all those different borders and all of those different items, which, Amazon doesn't have to. They just have to manage what street do we have to do to get to your house.
Very interesting. Final question. What advice would you give aspiring logistic leaders about resilience, judgment, leadership in these very complex global operations?
So say that again. What?
Yeah. What advice would you give aspiring logistics leaders about resilience, judgment, and leadership in complex global operations like the ones you deal with?
So I think the biggest thing is, and this goes across the board for anything, whether it's military, whether it's civilian, and it's to have a sense of humor. I think the only way to make it through life in general is whether you're laughing at yourself. Now, you can only laugh at yourself for the same problem 2 times. After that, nobody cares anymore. It's not funny. But you have to have a certain level of humor to make it through a lot of issues and be resilient. And I think you also have to have forethought. So if you know that you are going to be working in an area, you need to try and think, how do we do this ahead of time and plan these routes out? So organization helps, but having a strong team around you, having the ability to laugh at yourself and find humor in an issue while you're trying to fix it, not being so stern and so strict in the way you do things that culturally becomes a problem. You kind of, as in logistics especially, you need to understand geography. So you need to understand that, all right, so you're going from Chile, Valparaiso, from Cordoba in Argentina. It's not that far, right? Well, there's a big mountain range that you have to go through. Yeah. And the roads may not take you directly through there. And it's actually faster to fly from Cordoba to Buenos Aires over to Santiago and then go down to Valparaiso. It seems crazy, but we do that all the time. And understanding that, similar to what they said I think Albert Einstein said it, sometimes a straight line is not the fastest route. And so you have to maintain an open mind from culture, from geography, from humor to try and figure this out, because it's funny. Your team comes on and you have to make a joke sometimes to get a little bit of levity in there. So, but you also have to understand politics. And I think more than anything, logistics tends to touch every area of a company, whether they didn't get their pens and now they can't write because we didn't do correct supply chain, redistribution, or whether we're moving a sample from from somewhere in Africa to the United States or Canada. You have to understand geopolitical items. You have to always be aware of what's going on politically in different areas. You have to be able to communicate with your clients. If you're going to move up in leadership, and there's some people that are very happy with where they're at, but as you move up in leadership, you have to, you kind of have to be a sales person on these ideas. So that means you have to be open. You have to be communicative. You have to understand geopolitics. You have to understand geography. And then you have to be aware of other things that are important. Some areas, environmental parts may be important. Other areas, they may not be. So you have to be able to think outside the box and say, all right, and in management in general, this is the end point. Who cares where we start? Let's work our way back, find the bottleneck, fix that. And then now we have to work our way back again. And I think that's an important part in logistics, is having all those, but being able to look at that final point and work your way back. And, you find those granular points, those smaller items as you work your way back, but you really have to be able to see the forest through the trees. And I think that's the most important part of really working through logistics. And in the end is remembering something that happened and you and your team being able to laugh at like, I can't believe we worked 18 hours to get kits to location that didn't need them for another 4 weeks. They just need to check something off their box and they get a bonus. That's kind of what happens sometimes, unfortunately. And they don't give us all the information because if they knew we had the information, we would figure a more cost-effective way to do something. And they just want to get it there. And sometimes that's just how it goes. You deal with what you're given and you just do what you have to do and just put your head down and work through it and then laugh at it afterwards.
Pretty cool. Ben, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate talking to you. And
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
It was great. Thank you. And I hope I wasn't too verbose in some of those answers. I'm from New York. I don't have a problem speaking ever. So
take it easy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diego. All right, take care.
That's a wrap on today's deep dive with supply chain optimizers. If you found value in our controversial tactics and data-driven stories, don't forget to hit follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Have a burning question or want to share your own optimization success? Connect with me, Diego Solorzano, on LinkedIn, or for more information on how we can help you transform your supply chain and logistics operations, visit thesteya.com. Thanks for listening.